Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I am sharing a conversation that I had with David Lora, a leader in the United States Army. We discussed accountability and ownership and a lot of different topics that are really important for leaders to consider. They're not things that can necessarily be seen, but they are things that we need to be aware of every single day, both in ourselves and in those that we lead. Good morning. Welcome to the podcast. So I'm going to start by having you introduce yourself and tell us your style of leadership.
Thank you, Natasha. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today and with your guests. This is really incredible what you do for everybody. My name is David Lora. I'm an Army officer right now, but I think my leadership style really comes down to the two things that I'm passionate about, leading and teaching. And I think I'm probably more of a teacher than anything else. I've been in the Army now for 13 years. Before that, I was a ROTC graduate from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. I spent my last 13 years as a military intelligence officer, and honored to continue to serve and really enjoying my time in the Army now. Having these experience with leading, teaching, and intertwining both of those two. So my leadership style, I think that comes down to what I think are the three most important parts of leadership. Two biggest responsibilities and two questions that I think every organization needs to ask themselves every day is, where are we going? What is the next step to get there? And then last major responsibility I think for leaders is to set the culture of the organization. I think it took me a while to get there after 13 years in the Army and to read about this topic quite a bit and talking to folks about it. I think before I came to this conclusion, I think I used the Army's definition of leadership, which is to provide purpose, direction, motivation, and improve the organization, which I still agree with. But as I have tried to apply it on a day-to-day basis and thinking about how we can improve an organization overall, I've really come to describe leadership and what I hope that I can bring as those three things of answering the question of where are we going, what do we need to do to get there, and then setting the culture for the organization. That's kind of how I see leadership.
I love that. And I really appreciate when you said leader and teacher, because I think the best leaders really do have the heart of a teacher. If you're missing that point, I think you leave people behind way too much. When you can acknowledge that part of yourself, that teaching means so many different things, just like leadership does. I just love how you married those two things in your style.
It's certainly a result of my upbringing. Both my parents were teachers and my wife is a teacher. It comes from a family of teachers. So it has grown on me, and I think that's probably one of the things I enjoy the most about my time in the Army.
So was there a specific event that empowered you to identify yourself as a leader, or something occurred that you're like, I'm a leader, I'm the one in charge?
There were certainly major events that occurred over the last couple of years, but thinking back to my very first assignment, and even before that, when you're in training after being commissioned in the Army, you start wearing the rank of a commissioned officer right away. And I think from that moment, people might see you a little differently when they see you in uniform. And personally, I believe that every interaction is an opportunity to set the culture, but it's also a leadership moment in every interaction you have. Although I wasn't really responsible for anybody else or supervisor until after a year in the Army, I had those experiences with NCOs that were training me, with my peers as a leader, as a very young officer. Experiences that definitely shaped me as a leader. My first couple years in the Army were, unfortunately, it's the harder times that I think shaped me as a leader and made me really bring that to the forefront. I think there are times you come into a position just humbly and ready to learn and be a part of a team, which I think is still my perspective overall. But it's those difficult conversations, those difficult situations where your team needs you to be the leader. That happened when I was, first couple years in the Army, more than once, when we lost folks, or when somebody does something wrong too, it's an opportunity to lead and correct the ship for the entire team.
And I really like how you said that every interaction sets the culture, because I'm very much into relationship cultivation. But with that, you are setting a culture. And I always tell people that the conversation is the relationship. So when you're interacting with people, you are setting things up well. Every time you interact, you really do have an opportunity. And I think when you can understand yourself more as a leader and be more authentic in that, I think that helps that go even further, helps people be more authentic with you, creates that psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
And then really creates a culture where we can respect each other and we can interact in a really productive way.
Yeah, thank you. I like that.
So based on your experience, how do you define accountability?
I think there's a couple things to it, but I think it's in some ways it's a process, but I think there's a layered approach to accountability too. And I think for me, it's got to start with myself. That begins with setting small goals and doing the small disciplines that I have to do to set myself up and to make sure that I can be a good leader. From there, I think accountability is at the peer level and then moving into the organization level. And at the peer level, I think that really means being humble enough to not take credit for an organizational win and not caring who does take credit for that. At the organizational level, I think on the positive side is that can get you where you're trying to go overall. That's, there are systems to set that up of accountability for the organization. If you really understand where you're going, then key performance indicators will keep you accountable and keep the team going the same direction, which is important too. But again, it's really got to start with the individual level, with yourself, and then with peers, humbly being a part of a team. And if folks are committed to that, then I think that'll get to that third level of at the organization level. How do we hold ourselves accountable to get where we're really trying to go?
I love that. I really appreciate that, the self to the team to the organization, because I think there's also, with most things, there's this actual 360-degree dial, right? Where it's like, it starts in the center, it starts with where I am, and then where are we going, right? But then it's like the senior leaders, it's my peers, it's subordinates or other people.
Yeah.
And when you can look at things like that, whether it's accountability or leadership or teaching, it's like, yeah, if I'm not oriented, this compass is pointless. So I have to be centered and oriented so that I can say, okay, who needs these different resources or, this different mindset? And with accountability, I know it's one of my top values because there is this self-accountability. And it's not just, did I do what I say was what I was going to do? To me, it's also, am I being accountable for my emotions and for how they're landing on other people? Am I being accountable for the things that I say? And am I being as inclusive as possible? So I think there's all these different, you said it perfectly, all these different layers. But if you can't be accountable even to yourself and for your own actions and thoughts and emotions and words, then you can never ask anybody else to be accountable either. It would be hypocritical.
Yeah. And I certainly don't think I'm perfect at that. I bet nobody is perfect at doing that. That's tough. And probably a fight that I have every morning when I want to get out of bed and do reading that I need to do or head off to work or do something else. I think there's always that struggle there, which I think is okay. That's a natural tendency to have that of how am I going to keep myself accountable? So is there a tool that you use to do that, to hold yourself accountable for small things?
I am big on journaling. And in my journal, it is the place where I am the most honest. Now, my journal's not interesting. If somebody were to get it, they'd be like, a bunch of feelings. But in reality, that's where I can really look at something and say, I think I made a mistake here, or I think I did this. What are my next steps? What do I need to learn to fill in that gap? Is there an apology I need to make, whether that's to myself or someone else? And then how am I going to realistically move forward after this? What about you? Do you have a tool?
I think that's one of the most difficult parts, though, is writing down, figuring out exactly how you need to be accountable for somebody else. That is the highest friction point for me, for sure. One of the people that keeps me accountable is my son. So I want to be trustworthy, father of character, and a good dad for him. But when I start to think about that, how did yesterday go doing that? That's tough. That's tough to do, especially to write those things down. So I use a similar tactic for keeping myself accountable. And I like to think of it as feedback and reflection and how things went. So I separate those out with a month, a season, certainly after completing a job. So after I do a job for a year, then I'll sit down for a while and identify some formal feedback that I had and then try to build my own self-awareness. But I think that's part of accountability too. And that can be a tough exercise sometimes, especially at the micro scale. So just last week, what went well, what didn't really go well. That's one way I keep myself accountable because I'm such an extrovert. The other thing that I use is I just tell people. So if I tell my wife and my friends and people at work that I'm doing something or I'm working towards something, for me, that personally helps, just that idea of connection there. There's zero pressure from anybody else to accomplish that. But one thing that kind of helps that process is just putting the goal out there in the universe. And
I appreciate too that you mentioned the reflection combined with feedback. because I think all of us get feedback that we hate, right? In reality, all the feedback we want is that we're great. And then if it's negative, we don't want it. But I know that for me, when I get feedback, if I feel emotional about it or I feel defensive about it, I try to really get in my own head and be like, what about this is true? And have I heard this before? And whether I'm going to say that to that person in that moment, or I need to reflect on it later in my journal or whatever. But I think you're absolutely right in that feedback, because people are showing us our blind spots. They're showing us all these different things, and we just have to be open enough to listen.
I think my perspective shifted on feedback just a couple of years ago. And now I think I try to purposely hold on to even that most difficult feedback that I hear. And the rule that I created for myself is that regardless of what the negative feedback is, I will say thank you. Then I go to the same reflection loop of what did I do to create this? If this person didn't trust me, I had an impact on it. I did 50% of it, of this relationship. So what did I do to create this? If it's valid or not, I try to leave that to the side. But if someone else feels that way, then to your original point before, like I had a part in that.
Well, like you said, sometimes it's valid and sometimes it's not. We can do whatever we want with it. I think that as we mature as professionals, we just kind of learn how to take that more in stride and be like, oh, okay, maybe I do that and I'm going to work on that and not let it devastate us, or not just brush it off either. Like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, or that girl doesn't know what she's talking about. So yeah, I think that, that ability to just be like, yeah, what about this is true? Like, what is it that I don't want to be perceived that way? So something I'm doing is creating that perception, and how do we fix that? Why is accountability important in leadership? And we've touched on this a little, but specifically to leaders, why is it so important?
Accountability is important for leaders, and what comes to mind is what we say about NCOs in the Army is be, know, do, but to show the way, you need to go the way, is just said a different way. I think it's important for leaders to demonstrate that. And Covey, one of my favorite authors, talks about how trust is built through character and competence. And I think character is built through holding yourself accountable and demonstrating that you're a reliable person, that you're accountable, that someone can count on you. I think that is the real base of the speed of trust, which improves organizations. So that's on the individual level. And then I think accountability is important for leaders, organizational level, because you can in place processes every day and every week that gets you to where you're trying to go. And this is something that there are a lot of companies that do this and processes out there, but ultimately goes back to how I originally described leadership of where are you going? What's the vision of the company or the organization? And then what is the next step to get there? And I think that is really the crux of a lot of situations with leadership and organizations is how do we create that process today that gets us where we need to go and hold ourselves accountable in the most positive way so we can all improve the team.
And I think when you get to that organizational level, there are people who make up the organization, obviously, but now it's as a person, you can be accountable, but now you're like telling everybody else, like as an organization, as a group, we need to be accountable. And this is what that looks like in our organization. And with that, I think that there's this nuance and there's all these different perceptions and upbringings, and there's all gray space in life. It's never black or white. So depending on cultural differences or emotional differences, what people view as accountable is different. So yeah, when you get to those higher levels, it becomes how do we help this organization when you're not putting it on any single person, right? Which you don't want to, because it's not about blame, but it really is about like, how do we get everybody as a group to be accountable in the same way? And I think that's such an interesting challenge for leaders, because you're still accountable for yourself. And then you also have to understand all the different people that you're working with. And then if there are multiple levels in the hierarchy, if you're at the top, you're not necessarily going to understand the people and how they feel at different levels below you.
In my current job, we're trying to use key performance indicators. So very small things that we can do every week to get to our larger objectives. What we're working on, but I think there's never a perfect answer for that.
How can leaders demonstrate accountability when they succeed? And then how can they also demonstrate it when they fail?
You can demonstrate leadership when the team succeeds by just saying thank you and bringing it to the forefront of the team. Jim Collins talks about how as they achieve major goals, he calls them BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. But as they achieve those, there's a party for the team, and it is a team objective that everybody gets to together, and they take 6 months to a year, sometimes longer than that to get to, but it's visible for everyone, and you get there together. There's a celebration on the end. I think on the smaller level, it's at the end of the week. It is a thank you. At the beginning of the meeting, it is a written note to somebody or just a comment to them at their desk saying thank you for helping us get there. I think that's where you can reinforce on the positive side of accountability that can just improve over time in your organization and keep the ball rolling.
And earlier you had mentioned the humility that comes with leadership when people are accountable, not attributing it to any one thing, especially as the leader, right? That like you see all the moving parts and how they all work together. There's that book, The 5 Love Languages, which is fine. But there's also The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace, also by Gary Chapman. And he essentially talks about those same things, but how they play out in a professional environment. And so that's just it. If somebody writes me a little note, that's it. For the rest of my life, I will do whatever to help them. Because I just appreciate that. I know the effort that goes into that, and that means something to me. But to really acknowledge the reward only matters if it's a reward to that person, if it's valuable to that person. So in knowing your people as a leader, when people are very accountable and things are achieved, to be able to reward them in the way that they find valuable, I think is one of the 5 billion tasks of leadership.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the more fun side is when you're successful, how do you hold people accountable and what do you do there? That's definitely the more fun side of leadership. And I think that's easier for us to lean into as opposed to the original question of what do you do as the organization fails or how do you hold folks accountable? For me, this is a place I struggle. And I think it comes back to, I put a lot of weight on the context. So there's this idea called attribution bias, fundamental attribution bias, which really just means that we put too much weight on the individual if they fail, and we don't put enough weight on the organization's impact of that. And then when somebody does really well, we attribute that to the organization overall that they were taken care of. So I think that's my deliberate default is look at what did the organization do to limit this person or to prevent this individual, this small team from being accountable, from getting to where they need to go and meet their objectives. So that's the first question for me. The second question for leaders to ask themselves when they fail, when they want to hold their organization accountable, is just understanding the direction that you're going. So if a team didn't get there, it might not be their fault for not achieving the mission, but it also might be on the larger organization's fault for forcing the wrong direction. What I mean by that is if not everyone is on board with the direction you're going and what needs to be accomplished, then they're not going to get there. They're not going to do it in time. It's not going to be the standard that you want. So 2 questions to consider is how does the environment impact this person failing and not being accountable? And the second one is where they go in the right direction. I think we need to focus on those first. And for me, that is really the starting point is when we fail and how do we hold ourselves accountable?
I agree that we do place so much emphasis in the wrong places when things fail. We just need a fall guy, like we need a scapegoat. So we just start pointing at people. When in reality, you're absolutely right. Some people just are not in a place that is their strengths. So we need to help them with that. Either get them into a place where it is or help them, do that horizontal development of how do we get you better at your job. Also, I think I have been in situations where I unrealistically had an expectation that when people came into the organization that they would be ready for certain tasks and they weren't. And I think also so we work on the person, but then also I think when a group of people, or whether it's one person or a group, doesn't understand something or something wasn't communicated well and something fails, I think that I either went too fast in my communication and I just either shot it over the wrong medium. Maybe it needed to be face-to-face and I did it email, but I either went too fast or I was talking about things that they didn't know about. So I was trying to connect. I didn't try to connect it to things that they knew. And instead I'm just like, it's like when I go outside, if I were to tell my dogs to heel, they don't know what that is. They've never heard that word before. So, it's not that people are dogs, but it's the same with people where if you're saying things to them that they don't know, and you're not checking in to make sure that the communication is actually landing, because as leaders, it's our responsibility to make sure that communication is happening. We try it in all different ways. Those two things can definitely lead to the failures. I also really appreciated that you said when you talk to people, so when something goes wrong or fails, the first thing you want to do is kind of find out the context. And I love that, because I love the coaching mentality that all leaders should have, but that really comes with those moments, because it's great learning for the coach. It's great learning for the person being coached. At Columbia, their executive coaching model, there's 3 questions of what's up, what matters, and what's next. And I think that if you can follow along that, even with something like this, it may be high, emotionally charged or whatever, but then you're actually getting to what occurred or didn't that needed to, and you're really showing that person that you care about them. How does ownership align with accountability?
I think ownership is the starting block for accountability. I think that you can hold yourself accountable after understanding that whatever the result is, it's going to be yours. You're going to own it. Even when it's difficult, to go back to your boss and say, this is completely my responsibility. Having that perspective before you even engage in a goal or direction for your unit, knowing that whatever occurs is going to be on you, both for yourself as a leader and then for your team. I think that's the important part of ownership for me, is that's got to be the first step in accountability.
Yes, if we cannot going into it be like, no matter how this turns out, it's mine, it's my project, it's my responsibility. And so success or failure, I'm not going to blame anyone. I'm going to acknowledge that I'm the one who put this in motion. I love that. Can you tell us some real world examples of great leadership accountability?
The most recent example for me is when I took a new job. Actually, this summer, the very first thing my boss said to me was, run with scissors and I'll take care of you. So he told me in our first discussion that he was going to be accountable for everything that I did and my team did, regardless of what occurred. And that was really before I even introduced him to what our goals were for the quarter and the direction that we were trying to go. But he told me to literally run with scissors, which I thought was a good analogy for how he will cover us. He will take ownership of everything that I do. He'll definitely take responsibility. Then as we entered into counselings and more of a mentorship role, he's really demonstrated that too, saying, your craziest idea, I will have your back completely. I trust you implicitly. And he did not have to, because we hadn't worked together before, but that was his starting point, was I have you. So that was a terrific recent example of that.
It also, I think, engenders like more trust in that leader. Like they know how to deal with stuff. This isn't just, do what you want. This is, I know how to remove roadblocks. I know how to get you resourced. Like I know how to do these things. You do you, be as creative and as innovative as you need to be. What leadership advice would you offer current leaders in any organization?
Start with yourself is really my advice. And I think that's where I try to go too, is that regardless of what I do, I need to understand myself really well. So, folks can hear on your podcast and other things that you put out, self-awareness and understanding yourself and being able to understand how you're impacting others and the situation is so important to successful leadership and being part of a team. So for me, that's kind of where I start most days and before I start most jobs. And I try to reflect back on as myself. So self-awareness, preparing myself, which might sound counter to what you would think to be a good leader. But I think focusing on yourself, understand feedback, understand how you impact the room when you walk in, I think it's critical, and that always leads to folks being better. You're not going to be worse as a leader by thinking about yourself or taking care of yourself. In the Army, we say, pack your rucksack first. That doesn't mean that you take your subordinates' time and do that or leave. It means that you get there early and you pack your rucksack before anyone else arrives, so that when they're there, you are ready to go and you can commit yourself to them and the team overall in the direction you gotta go. The other great example that I saw recently was a lead with character. And even when that is difficult, my boss really demonstrated that recently as he got somebody right on the right azimuth, so got somebody back on the right track after something didn't go well. But it was hard for him in that moment to say, we need to pause this meeting that we're in and get us back on track. And that was a very difficult conversation for him to have for those 30 seconds. But I think that'll be something that I really take from my current organization and keep with me. So lead with character, even when it is most difficult. It's a terrific example when you see that. And it's pretty rare, even in the Army too.
We all love to think that in those tough moments, we would say something or we would get something back on track. But I think that what we forget is that it is hard. It is hard to interrupt something. There's social pressures, there's anxiety, and no matter if you have been leading for 50 years or for 5 days, there is something very intense about difficult conversations and the social fear that we have of confrontation.
I found that it's difficult for me to receive advice, but I've never felt like reading a book about leadership or something that might contribute to my job or to me as a professional is time wasted. I've never felt like that. Any time that I can spend reflecting on myself or reading about a topic related to my profession or about myself is never time wasted.
I 1,000,000,000% agree. Sometimes you will then have a framework, a story, an example, a thought leader's kind of advice that then you can inject into a conversation that makes people start to think in a different way. Because if we're just reading, I have a friend who kind of just reads the Army regulations, which is fine. Also, but that's the limit. That's the cap on what kind of insight you can offer. But if you can pull something else in, not everybody is reading these other things, so pull in those examples and that knowledge. Which leader has insight that you have found to be valuable in your leader development?
I know this is the Eisenhower series. I'll go back to the same era. George Marshall, I think, has meant a lot to me over the last 13 years in the Army. And that's really because of his humility and selfless service. He was a career staff officer who took jobs that the Army needed, that our country needed. And that really, for me, exemplified what a good leader can be, and to humbly take a position that, although you do not want it at the time, and there are better positions out there where you can have a different impact and be closer to the field and soldiers. Sometimes there's a job that the Army needs you to take and your nation needs you to be in, and he really did that. So there were some insights in his career that I really enjoyed, those two major ones. For me, the other leaders that I look up to, one of them, Jocko Willink, because of his perspective on ownership and taking responsibility. I think he's a leader of character as well. For me, the other folks that I think about in my day-to-day interactions that I want to emulate, my father, grandfather-in-law, and my future self version for my son and my family. So I want to be the type of leader that they would be proud of. So although my son hasn't given me an insight into leadership yet, he kind of exposes those wrinkles for you to consider. And I think that can be done for anybody, even if you don't have kids, of what is someone else from a different perspective going to think about my time as a leader. I think that wrinkle can give you some insights too and what you need to do.
I also really love that you mentioned George Marshall, because he was also one of Eisenhower's mentors. So someone he worked really hard, and then when these positions were available, he was ready to step into those. But I think that there is something so important about understanding that you want to serve, and that service means doing what people need you to do. And I think there's something that's like the true heart of a soldier in so many ways. So I have a ton of respect for George Marshall, and in being a staff officer for so long, having that perspective and having people that he mentored when he was far outranking them then pass him by, and he was never petty and he was never upset about that. He was like, this is, like you said, this is what the country needs from me, and that's what I'm going to do. So I love that. Do you have a book or resource that you recommend to others?
I can only recommend what I'm currently reading right now, which is on my mind quite a bit, which is Beyond Entrepreneurship 2.0 by Jim Collins, which I enjoy as a military leader, seeing from the business side and what an entrepreneur would recommend. This 2.0 book is a rewrite of his book from the 80s. So I'm really enjoying that. And there are tactical lessons that you can take from that book and apply it to any organization now, and certainly in the Army, but also to small teams. So I'm enjoying that very much in the front of my mind these days.
This has been amazing. Thank you so, so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Natasha. I really appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate what you've done for so long in the Army, for many of our soldiers, the cadets at West Point, but also for doing this today and for the series and all the content that you put out over multiple platforms. So thank you for the opportunity to be a small part in this portrait that you're painting of leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equipping Leaders. This season, there is an associated blog for each podcast episode, which can be found on my website, natashacheyenne.com, under Leadership Journal. My website also features other leadership development content, such as frameworks, book recommendations, a weekly newsletter, and other downloadable content. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha and on Twitter and Facebook at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.